He laughed while signing. The divorce papers. He had no idea she owned half the country. The marble halls of the Harrington Federal Courthouse had seen 1,000 powerful men walk through its doors. Senators, CEOs, generals, men who believed the weight of their titles gave them dominion over every room they entered. Men who had built empires from nothing, who had shaken hands with presidents, who had watched their names carved into the sides of buildings like monuments to their own inevitability. But on a gray Tuesday morning in October, not one of them had ever witnessed anything quite like what was about to unfold at Table 7. Richard Harlow sat down in his burgundy suit like a man who had already won. And in his mind he had. He adjusted his cufflinks slowly, deliberately, the way a man does when he wants the room to notice his calm. He smoothed his tie, rolled his shoulders back, and picked up the pen with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from a lifetime of never being told no. Beside him, his soon-to-be ex-wife, Elena, sat quietly in a navy blazer, a diamond necklace catching the cold fluorescent light above. She said nothing. She simply watched him with steady, unreadable eyes. He didn't even glance at her. Finally, Richard muttered under his breath, loud enough for his attorney to hear, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. Let's get this over with. 3 years earlier, Richard Harlow had married Elena Voss at a small ceremony in upstate New York. No lavish ballroom, no celebrity guest list, no photographers camped outside iron gates. Just 30 people, a field of wildflowers, and a woman in a simple white dress who looked at him like he was the most important person in the world. Richard had thought he was doing her a favor. He was, by every visible measure, the successful one. He ran Harlow Capital, a mid-sized investment firm with offices in Manhattan and Chicago. He had the penthouse on the 54th floor with a view that stretched all the way to New Jersey on a clear day. He had the connections, senators, hedge fund managers, 3 former cabinet members on speed dial. He had the reputation that preceded him into every room, the kind that made junior analysts straighten their posture when he walked past. Elena, meanwhile, had no LinkedIn profile, no visible career, and a habit of reading thick legal documents in the evenings that Richard had always dismissed with a wave of his hand as her little hobby. She never talked about money. She never asked for anything extravagant. She cooked on Sunday mornings, took long walks through Central Park in the afternoons, and laughed at things Richard never found funny. Old films, handwritten letters, the way rain sounded on the window of a moving train. She had come into the marriage with one suitcase and a quiet smile. He had assumed that meant she had nothing. It was the most expensive assumption of his life. In the beginning, Richard had genuinely believed the marriage would work. Elena was different from the women in his social circle. She didn't perform ambition, didn't weaponize charm, didn't compete. She simply existed with a kind of stillness that he had found attractive at first, a grounding force in a life that moved at a speed most people couldn't sustain. But stillness, Richard eventually decided, was the same as emptiness. He began canceling dinners, working later, taking calls at the table. When Elena asked about his day, he gave one-word answers. When she suggested they take a trip, somewhere quiet, somewhere away from the noise of the city, he laughed and told her he didn't have time for vacations, that not everyone had the luxury of doing nothing all day. She had absorbed those words without flinching. That should have told him something. The cracks didn't appear gradually. They split open all at once, the way ice does when the pressure beneath it finally becomes too great to contain. It started when Richard decided to expand Harlow Capital by acquiring a promising clean energy startup called Novaterra. The deal was worth $400 million, and Richard had spent 6 months convincing investors, restructuring debt, renegotiating terms, and maneuvering his board through 3 rounds of internal resistance. He was proud of it in the way only a man who has fought for something can be proud. It was the kind of deal that would define a career, the kind that gets written about in business school case studies 10 years later. He had already planned the press release. 2 weeks before closing, Novaterra's founder called Richard personally. "We've decided to go in a different direction," the founder said. His voice was carefully neutral, the tone of a man who had been coached on what to say. "What direction?" Richard demanded, sitting up straight in his office chair. Private, silent acquisition. We can't disclose the details at this time. You had a signed letter of intent, Richard said. His voice had gone cold. We understand. Our legal team will be in touch regarding compensation for preliminary costs. We're sorry for the inconvenience. The line went dead. The deal collapsed overnight. Richard lost 3 key investors who had committed capital specifically to the Novaterra acquisition. 2 board members resigned within the week, citing a loss of confidence in leadership's due diligence process. The Wall Street Journal ran a small but devastating headline. Harlow Capital fumbles. 400-meter energy deal. Sources. Site internal mismanagement. Richard sat in his office for 4 hours without moving, the city sprawling silently 43 floors below him. That evening he came home to find Elena at the kitchen island reading again, one of her thick legal documents, a highlighter resting between 2 fingers. He stood in the doorway and told her what had happened, not because he wanted comfort, but because the silence of the apartment felt unbearable. She set down her highlighter. She nodded slowly, said she was sorry, and offered to make dinner. He looked at her with something that had been quietly building for months, a low, simmering contempt that he had never bothered to examine. You wouldn't understand, he said. She didn't argue. She didn't look hurt. She simply turned the page. He walked to his study and closed the door. The divorce filing came 6 weeks later. Richard's attorney, a sharp-edged man named Gerald Foss, who had handled the dissolutions of 4 Fortune 500 marriages without a single unfavorable ruling, advised him to move quickly and cleanly. She has no documented income, Gerald said, spreading papers across the conference table. No business holdings registered in her name. No property, no investments we can trace. Under the prenuptial agreement, which she signed without requesting a single revision, she is entitled to a modest settlement. We're talking low 7 figures maximum, and I can negotiate that down further if she doesn't retain strong counsel. Richard leaned back in his chair. She won't. How do you know? Because she doesn't fight, Richard said simply. It's not who she is. Gerald nodded and made a note. This is going to be the cleanest split I've handled in 15 years. Richard felt nothing but relief. Clean and fast, the way he liked all his transactions. No mess, no drama, no complications. On the morning of the courthouse signing, he wore his best suit, the burgundy one, the one he saved for days when he needed to feel like himself. He shook hands with the bailiff at the door. He made a joke with Gerald about lunch. Reservations at a steakhouse on 52nd Street. He ordered his coffee black and drank it standing up, the way he always did before a deal closed. He sat down at table 7, picked up the pen, and smiled at the document in front of him, like it was a gift he had been waiting to unwrap for months. Elena arrived 5 minutes later. She had one attorney with her, a woman named Claire Whitfield, who was not well known publicly but was, in certain very specific legal circles, considered the most dangerous mind in private asset litigation in the northeastern United States. Claire carried a single leather folder. She wore a dark gray suit and no expression at all. Richard barely glanced at them. He was already signing. What happened next took 11 minutes, but it would be discussed in legal circles for 11 years. Claire Whitfield set her leather folder on the table, opened it with the precise movements of someone who had rehearsed nothing because they needed to rehearse nothing, and slid a single document across to Gerald Foss. Gerald picked it up with the casual confidence of a man who expected to find nothing surprising. His eyes moved across the first paragraph. His face changed. Then it changed again. Then it went very still in the particular way that faces go still when the mind is working, faster than the body can follow. Richard, he said, quietly. I'm almost done, Richard said, still writing, not looking up. Richard. Gerald's voice was different now, stripped of its courtroom. Polish. Flat. Careful. The voice of a man standing at the edge of something he does not yet fully understand, but already knows is enormous. Stop signing. Richard looked up slowly, with the mild irritation of someone interrupted mid-sentence. Claire Whitfield spoke for the first time since entering the room. Mr. Harlow, Her voice was even, unhurried, the way very certain people speak. My client, Elena Voss Harlow, is the sole heir and controlling trustee of the Voss Family Foundation, incorporated in Delaware in 1987 and registered across 12 countries. The foundation holds majority stakes in 43 companies, operating in renewable energy, aerospace technology, private banking, pharmaceutical logistics, and global infrastructure development. She paused for exactly 1 second. One of those companies is Novaterra Clean Energy Systems. The room did not go quiet. It went something beyond quiet, a kind of suspended stillness, as though the air itself had stopped moving. Richard's pen hovered above the paper. The prenuptial agreement you drafted, Claire continued, her voice never rising, never shifting, contains a clause on page 9, paragraph 4, which your client personally inserted, stating that any business assets introduced to the marriage are subject to equitable consideration in the event of irreconcilable dissolution. She tilted her head slightly to the left. Mrs. Harlow introduced herself to this marriage, and with her came everything she carried. Gerald had gone the color of copy paper. Richard's pen was still in his hand. He had not moved. The Voss Family Foundation, Claire said, placing a second document on the table with the same unhurried precision, is currently valued, including all subsidiary holdings, accrued assets, and pending acquisitions, at $1.3 trillion. No one in the room moved. Somewhere in the back of the courthouse, a phone buzzed twice and went to voicemail. The bailiff near the door shifted his weight from one foot to the other. A clerk at the far end of the room dropped a stapler and did not bend down to retrieve it. Richard Harlow, who had walked into that room 40 minutes ago, as a man who believed he was closing the simplest transaction of his professional life, sat completely still with a pen in his hand and looked at a number that rearranged everything he thought he knew. He turned and looked at Elena. For the first time all morning, he actually looked at her. Not through her, not past her, not at the space she occupied him, but at her fully, the way he had not looked at her in perhaps 2 years. She was watching him with the same calm expression she had worn every single evening at that kitchen island, not triumphant, not angry, not performing any emotion for the room, just a woman who had always known precisely who she was. Sitting quietly in a navy blazer, waiting with infinite patience for the moment, her husband finally decided to find out. You knew, Richard said. The words came out smaller than he intended, barely above a whisper. The whole time, you knew. Elena held his gaze without blinking. I knew what I was worth, she said. Her voice was gentle, without cruelty. You chose never to ask. The proceedings were postponed indefinitely pending legal review. Gerald Voss requested an emergency recess and spent 45 minutes in a private room on his phone. Richard sat across from 2 additional attorneys, who had been called in from separate firms, none of whom had ever encountered a case structured quite this way. The prenuptial agreement was reviewed 4 times by 3 different sets of eyes. The Voss Foundation documentation was verified through independent financial channels. By end of business that day, every number was real. Every stake was legitimate. Every word Claire Whitfield had spoken at that table was precise, accurate, and legally airtight. Elena Voss had never hidden her wealth. There were no offshore accounts, no shell companies designed to obscure, no deliberate architecture of concealment. The Voss Foundation was registered, documented, publicly verifiable to anyone who cared to look. Her name appeared in filings. Her signature sat on acquisition documents. The information had never been secret. It had simply never been sought. Richard Harlow had spent 3 years living beside one of the wealthiest human beings on the planet, and he had never once asked her a single question about her life before him. He had looked at her quietness and read it as vacancy. He had mistaken her stillness for absence. He had seen a woman with 1 suitcase and concluded, without investigation, that 1 suitcase was all there was. The Novaterra deal, the acquisition that had publicly humiliated him, that had cost him $400 million in committed capital and 2 board members and a Wall Street Journal headline he still couldn't read without his jaw tightening, had been redirected by Elena's foundation into a long-term private acquisition that was structured and approved before their marriage had even begun to fracture. It had not been retaliation. It had simply been sound investment strategy, executed by a woman who had been managing trillion-dollar decisions since before. Richard Harlow knew her name. He had built his entire career on the ability to read value before the market caught up. He had looked at his own wife every single day for 3 years and seen nothing. The final settlement was negotiated over 4 months and involved 17 attorneys across 3 states. Richard retained full ownership of Harlow Capital and the Manhattan penthouse. He retained his name and his reputation, though both required significant quiet reconstruction in the months that followed. Elena walked away with what had always belonged to her, plus a legal acknowledgement that sealed the terms of dissolution from public record. On her final morning in New York, Elena stood outside the courthouse steps in the same navy blazer. A black car waited at the curb. Her attorney stood a few feet away, reviewing something on her phone. The October air had turned sharp and clean, the kind of cold that makes the city look like a photograph of itself. A junior reporter from a financial news blog approached with a recorder held out like an offering. "Mrs. Voss," he said, slightly breathless. "How does it feel, walking away from a divorce as one of the wealthiest women in the world?" Elena looked at the recorder for a moment. Then she looked at the young man holding it. "I didn't walk away with anything I didn't already have," she said. "I just stopped allowing someone else to decide what it was worth." She turned, walked to the car, and got in. The door closed without a sound, and Richard Harlow, standing at a third-floor window above the courthouse steps, his hands in his pockets and his coffee gone cold, watched the car pull away and finally understood. The only question that had ever mattered, not what is she worth, but who is she? He had never thought to ask.